If you're not new to my channel, then you already know that I love to convert miniatures, and so it's probably no surprise to you that when I first saw the new Sigvald model, I knew immediately what I wanted to do with him. The ornate detailing of his armour reminded me of that worn by vampires, and not only those in the Warhammer world, but also in other fantasy genres as well. So, with this in mind, I set about making a few modifications to emphasise this aspect. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to turn Sigvald into a vampire lord. Naturally, I started out with the new plastic Sigvald miniature, who would form the vast majority of my new creation. I set about clipping away all the components required to build him from the sprue before cleaning up any mold lines and sprue tabs. But before I could use any of these parts, I needed to prepare some extra components. To help add some extra armor and also to bring in some vampiric flair to this conversion, I looked towards the Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon. Now this is of course also the same model found in the Start Collecting Flesh Eater Court set, so you can probably find some of these for sale online, or you could pester your friends for one. But now that I had the back half of the vampire torso, I needed to bring in my saw to help liberate the back half of the shoulders, and also the extra armor that would normally sit behind the head. To remove these, whilst also retaining as much of the components as possible, I needed to use my saw. I cut a little further out from the shoulders, as much as the space would allow me to, as this could be easily cleaned up later on. With the collar and shoulder pads removed from each other and the torso, I just needed to clean them up. I used my knife and cut away any extra plastic left over from the previous step, until I was left with two half shoulder pads. As I only had half of the shoulder pads, I needed to perform the same steps that I had applied to the rear of the torso to the front half of the Vampire Lord's torso as well. As I only needed the shoulder pads, I didn't need to be quite as careful as I had done before, but apart from that, the steps were the exact same. I started off using my handsaw to remove the shoulders before trimming back any remaining plastic from them using my knife. Once all the cutting and trims had been completed, I was left with the following components: two shoulder pads, each in two halves, and the neck armor, which I would be using as a gorget. My intention for these components was to change the profile of Sigvald's base model. The Vampire Lord shoulder pads are considerably less ornate than Sigvald's, and also a different shape, which would help to further distance my conversion's appearance from the original miniature. The gorget, on the other hand, would be a new addition. Not only would this help to bulk up the armour, but also add some sharper, more defined edges to offset the otherwise smooth nature of Sigvald's armour. However, attaching these extra components would prove to be tricky. I started off by comparing the gorget to its new torso. I used comparisons like this to create a rough guide of where I should be making cuts and by how much. I used my knife to make a series of small trims and then made regular checks as I did so. But it wasn't just the gorget that needed adjustment. The chest itself also needed a trim to remove the mark of Slaanesh from the centre, as well as the two small gems that are attached to the cloak. The removal of these would allow for the gorget to have a better fit. Speaking of which, once I felt that everything was fitting together nicely, I could finally make the joint permanent by using some glue. With the gorget in place, I could start to work on the shoulders. Before I did any test fitting, I needed to first remove the small tabs from the shoulders. Normally, these would be where you would attach Sigvald's shoulder pads to, but as I was using different pads, these would have just gotten in the way. I started by clipping them away before using my knife to smooth them out. Now that I had made all the relevant adjustments that were needed for the torso, I was able to assemble the torso and the legs together without worrying about these parts getting in the way as I made my trims. Similarly, I could then assemble the halves of the shoulders together as well. Sigvald comes with an impressive looking cloak, billowing out behind him, something that I wanted to retain for my Vampire Lord. However, I couldn't use the cloak in its current state due to the fact that there was a mark of Slaanesh emblazoned upon it. Naturally, I set about removing this with my knife, using a series of small and careful trims. But I didn't want to lose the entirety of this ornate detailing, so I just shaved back the crescent moon shape and its associated stalk, until I was left with a more generic looking embroidered detail. By this point, I already knew that I wouldn't be attaching the cape to the model just yet. Being such a large component, I knew that trying to paint it when the model was fully assembled would make painting both the cape and the rest of the model that much more difficult to achieve. But I had to check the fit of the shoulder pads. These would fit over the cloak, and so as a result, they would also need to be painted separately. So I temporarily attached the cape and temporarily attached the shoulder pads. This gave me the opportunity to see how well they would fit and if any further trims or adjustments were needed. Luckily, they were already sitting quite nicely, but had I needed to make changes, I would have had to do so very carefully so as to not break apart their two halves. With the shoulder pads and cloak checked, I could then put them to one side, but I wasn't quite done with the torso just yet. Being a follower of Slaanesh, Sigvald likes to keep his clothing to a minimum, which meant there were gaps between the thigh armour and the cuirass. This wouldn't make quite as much sense for a vampire lord, so I took this as an opportunity to further modify the armour from the original design by adding a few extra details. These extra details were found in the same kit as the shoulder pads and gorget in the form of the vampire's helmet. I began by clipping away the wings from the headgear and then trimming them back to follow the lines so that the ridges converged in a single point. With the wings removed and cleaned up, I could then attach them to the torso. I positioned them just above the thighs in much the same way as the original Vampire Lord had similarly styled panels. This helped to cover up the gap in the armour, as well as helping to balance out the extra armour that was added around the neck and the shoulders. The head, rather unsurprisingly, also came from the Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon kit. I'd already used the helmeted head, so opted to use the unhelmeted head instead. While I was tempted to modify Sigvald's hair and attach this to the new head, I felt that it would start to look too much like the original kit, so ultimately opted not to. However, to get this head to fit, I needed to make some adjustments to the neck. These were performed with my knife. I reduced the height of the neck slightly and squared off the bottom too. I made frequent comparisons against the torso during this stage to ensure that I wasn't cutting away too much. Once I was happy with the fit, much like the cape and the shoulders, this was left unattached for the time being as well. The final adjustments to make to the miniature were its armaments. Sigvald carries a rounded shield in his left hand and a rapier in his right. The sword fitted the vampire theme perfectly already, but the shield didn't follow the same aesthetic. I did look around for an alternative shield and found that most, including the one in the Zombie Dragon set, was simply too small for the slightly larger human. I ultimately decided to switch this out for a smaller blade and found the perfect left-handed blade in the Oralan Warden's kit. But before I could attach it, I first needed to remove Sigvald's left hand first. I used my clippers before tidying things up and cleaning up the cut with my knife. With Sigvald's hand cleared, I then needed to remove the hand from the rest of the High Warden's arm, and so again used my clippers before cleaning up that wrist. I checked the fit to ensure that everything was lining up and then glued this new sword into place. Finally, I added this new right-hand sword to complete the mirrored posture of the two blades being held out to each side of the miniature, which completed the conversion. I just needed to paint and base the model in some colours that now match this new theming and assemble everything together, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Vampire Lord. The base was the same as that found in Sigvald's kit, albeit with a few sharpened stakes that I made out of sprue, along with some additional battlefield debris to better reflect the miniature's new purpose. Also, instead of light and bright colours, I opted to use a more muted palette to really help the blood red of the armour to stand out. Now, this was probably one of my more drastic conversions. Quite often I build Space Marines out of Space Marines and use Nurgle components to build other Nurgle models, but changing a Chaos Prince to a Vampire Lord required a slightly different approach, and the result is something that I'm rather proud of. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below and make sure to subscribe to see my future work. And so the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently my top Patreon supporters are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, and Daniel Dowling. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these different kinds of conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out the description below for all the relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.